I'd like to spend a little bit of time now talking about the Russo-Japanese War, which was fought in 1904 and 1905. Generally, we can think of this as just a war between Russia and Japan, and there was very limited foreign intervention, although we'll look at that and maybe challenge that a little bit as we move forward. It's not unique, but it is interesting as being a war between two states, but no part of the war was fought in either one of those states. It was fought entirely in countries other than Russia and Japan, notably China, specifically the province of Manchuria, but the peninsula of Korea is also important. I think there are 5 important things for us to talk about when we talk about the Russo-Japanese War. Obviously, we're interested in what happened, but we also want to look specifically at what the theaters of war were. In other words, what role land forces played and what role naval forces played. I think we're interested in the technologies that were used in the war, what role those had to play and how those affected the outcome of the war. We want to look at how human and economic resources were mobilized, and then we're going to look at how foreign countries were involved. I think it's really important just from the beginning to note that the Japanese were not prepared for anything like a total war, never believed that they could defeat the entire Russian Empire in a protracted or a long war, and therefore needed to have an exit strategy from the beginning. They were very interested in this being a limited conflict. And so if you think about the Anglo-Japanese alliance, from a Japanese perspective, the purpose of the Anglo-Japanese alliance was to limit foreign involvement to being just a battle with Russia, to keep France out of the war. And in fact, for Japan, the faster the war concluded, the better they would be. There were obviously 2 factors which limited Russian involvement, how far it was by land and how far it was by sea. The British would close the Suez Canal to the Russian fleet, and so the Russian fleet had to take the long way around Africa if any ships were to come from Russia, as in fact they would. And the Trans-Siberian Railway was single-tracked, quite slow, and at the very beginning of the war, there wasn't even a railway around Lake Baikal. And if you look at your map, you'll see Lake Baikal looks quite small on that, but Lake Baikal is actually just a little bit larger than the whole country of Switzerland in Europe. So that's quite a disadvantage to not have that tracked in the beginning. As the railroad improves, Russian troop movements will improve as well. So time is not on the side of the Japanese, and that's an important thing to think of throughout the war. The war essentially, I think it's easiest to think of it as 2 Russian fleets and 2 Japanese armies. Initially we have the Japanese army which lands just north of Port Arthur, and then we have a Japanese army that lands in Korea, and they sort of make their way up and try to group together. And then the Russian fleet, which is essentially trapped in Port Arthur from the beginning of the conflict, is in one place, and that's what I'd like to introduce the vocabulary term to you: fleet in being. The Russian fleet in Port Arthur is not particularly dangerous while it's in Port Arthur, but it does tie up the rest of the Japanese Navy, keeping them in Port Arthur. So a fleet in being is a fleet that can command the interest and demand the attention of your enemy. After the Russian Pacific Fleet is holed up in Port Arthur, the Tsar dispatches his Baltic Fleet to set sail. They end up having to make a 7.5-month journey from the Baltic Sea around to the theater of the Russo-Japanese War. They'll end up coming into kind of the Korean Strait, the strait that's called Tsushima, where there will be a great naval battle. But if we think of it as these two Russian fleets trying to converge and these two Japanese armies trying to converge, I think that's a neat way of thinking about what is going on during the war. And the Japanese strategic objective, of course, is to destroy the first Russian fleet before the second Russian fleet arrives. And the Russian objective is to hold out as long as possible. For Japan, then, a series of large, quick, decisive battles will be to their advantage, and that's what their war plan calls for. The Russians would have been better off fighting a war of attrition, delaying their tactics as long as possible while troops were able to arrive. But because the first move by the Japanese is to surround and to besiege Port Arthur, the Russians are also put into a situation where they need to win battles before Port Arthur is captured. And this puts them into, I guess I would say, playing the Japanese game, so playing into the strengths of and needs of the Japanese. After the war opens with a surprise attack by the Japanese on Port Arthur, and at the same time the landing of another Japanese army just to the north in Liaoyang and in Inchon in South Korea. So Port Arthur is cut off by both land and sea, and you have a Japanese army that's coming up from Korea. The Russian army essentially is able to wait for the advance of the Japanese army right along the Manchurian-Korean border. And that border is a natural border defined by the Yalu River. And the first great chance and the first great battle that I'd like to focus on is the Battle of the Yalu River, which happens on the 25th of April through to the 2nd of May in 1904. And this is a battle that I think is characterized by a Russian defensive failure. They simply don't understand where exactly it is that the Japanese are going to cross. The Japanese are able to trick them by building a large bridge in one area, but actually creating these sort of portable bridges, which they're able to bring at another point along the river. So that's actually an important technological innovation, which is these portable bridges that allow for the crossing of the river. Once the Japanese are able to cross the river, there are two really important things here. First of all, they now literally can meet up with their army in the Liaoyang Peninsula, but also, even though this is not such a large battle, and casualty rates will be much, much higher later in the war, this gives them credibility, and this credibility is essential for one of the two aspects of foreign intervention that I'd like to think about in terms of this war, and that's foreign money. The Japanese, after the Battle of the Yalu River, are able to raise war loans, both in New York and in London, so both from United States banks and from British banks. And this is essential. Ultimately, more than 80% of Japan's spending on the war is going to be financed through loans, either through domestic loans, which we usually call war bonds, or through these foreign loans. And it's much, much bigger of a conflict than any previous Japanese war. So the Japanese, of course, had fought the Sino-Japanese War, and they actually had fought this along the same basic area that they're going to fight the Russo-Japanese War. The Russo-Japanese War, even though it happens within a decade of the Sino-Japanese War, is going to be 10 times as expensive and really absolutely dominate and nearly destroy the Japanese economy. So the Battle of Yalu River is important both because it gets the Japanese into Manchuria. They fight their way into Manchuria, so now they have two armies in Manchuria, but also because it builds up the confidence of foreign financiers who are willing to lend them money, and that proves to be really, really decisive. Obviously, they already have the British allied with them, and the French are going to stay out of the war. So the third foreign power that is worth thinking about is the United States. And the United States has great sympathy for the Japanese cause in terms of public opinion. The war is sort of presented as a little man versus the big man, or from the biblical story, a David versus Goliath. And early on, the Japanese realized that the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, will be an important tool, instrument, ally, if he's willing to negotiate a peace, because they are going to need to have a negotiated peace if they're going to win this war. It won't be a decisive battle. The Japanese are never going to march on Moscow, nor do they want to fight so long that the Russians are worn down and beaten. So, in the opening of the war, in their quest for a fast victory and their hope that they will be able to get the United States to intervene and create a negotiated peace, the first two key battles are the attack on Port Arthur, which doesn't destroy the Russian fleet, but locks them into the port. So the Japanese fleet is still busy protecting Port Arthur. And in fact, the Russian fleet will try to come out at one point. There's a battle called the Battle of the Yellow Sea, but then they'll be forced back into Port Arthur. So that dominates the Japanese Navy, is just keeping the Russian Navy in check. And meanwhile, the Battle of Yalu River, which allows the two Japanese armies now to be both on the peninsula. The first really, really large battle is the Battle of Liaoyang. And the Battle of Liaoyang starts on the 26th of August and ends on the 3rd of September. And this forces the Russians to retreat north and pushes them back off the peninsula. So although they will launch a counteroffensive in October, this is now the first really big, decisive land battle. And it sets up a time where the Japanese are going to be able to really attack Port Arthur. And the Japanese are spectacularly ineffective in their attacks on Port Arthur. They have a number of attacks throughout the fall of 1904 on Port Arthur. And in each one, they lose more men than they kill. And this really demonstrates how powerful technology has become in terms of protecting the defender, how strong defensive technology has become. Machine guns and artillery can really, and the high ground, these things can really help out the Russian defensive effort. However, finally at the end of November, after a series of really bloody, really ineffective battles, the Japanese are able to capture a hill just outside of Port Arthur. It's actually called 203-meter Hill. And from there, they're able to put their artillery on, and then they're able to fire down at the Russian ships that are being held in the harbor of Port Arthur. And then one by one, essentially, they're able to sink the Russian fleet. So the Russian fleet is actually sunk and destroyed from land, not by sea. Port Arthur will then surrender on the 2nd of January. So about a month after the hill's captured, Port Arthur surrenders. And this is going to allow both Japanese armies to come together and is going to lead to the greatest land battle of the war, which is going to be called the Battle of Mukden, or nowadays we would call it Shenyang, but Mukden is what it's called at the time, which will take place in the winter of 1905. Meanwhile, though, and sort of in the back of our sea, we have to remember that the Russian fleet is sailing around from the Baltic around the Horn of Africa and eventually over to Asia. And we actually have at the beginning of its voyage a moment which almost turns this conflict into something that would be a lot more resembling a world war, which is that on the 21st of October, the Russian fleet, perhaps being a bit paranoid and a bit unrealistic, believes that in the North Sea, so actually fairly close to Britain, it's spotted some Japanese submarines or Japanese ships, and it fires on them. It ends up these are just British fishermen, and this area is called Dogger Bank. And this crisis at Dogger Bank, actually one of the ships is sunk, almost threatens to bring the British into the war. And of course, if the British had come into the war, the French would have needed to come into the war, and so the British government does everything it can to tamp down the war fever. This is very much not in the plans of the British government to become involved. In fact, the whole point, some would say, of the Anglo-Japanese alliance was to keep the British out of the war and to keep the French out of the war. So they have to handle this very delicately, because literally British men have been killed by a Russian fleet. And so that Britain doesn't get involved in the war, again, probably sheds some light for us on why it is that the Anglo-Japanese Treaty was signed in the first place. So as soon as the Russian Second Fleet starts going, the Japanese naval commander, whose name is Togo, he's much more concentrated on protecting his ships than he is on destroying the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, and that's probably why Port Arthur is ultimately destroyed from land instead, at the cost of many, many, many Japanese lives. But he is able to use mines, underwater explosives, to keep the Russian fleet in Port Arthur. And some of his, actually, the sinking of the Russian ships that are sunk at sea instead of from shells on land, the majority of those are sunk using mines, where they're tricked into coming out and running into these mines. So mines also play an important technological role. So as we're moving toward, as the fleet is coming in, and this is the key moment, once Port Arthur is surrendered in January, the Japanese fleet is able to go back, refit itself, repair its its ships, and essentially get ready for what will obviously be a major battle, because once Port Arthur has fallen, the Japanese know that the Russian fleet has to head to Vladivostok. This is the only place it can go, and there's really only 3 ways you can get there if you're coming up from the south, and so the Japanese have to figure out a way to defend all 3. But meanwhile, there's essentially the largest land battle of the war, and in fact the largest land battle in history up until that time, which is the Battle of Mukden, or Shenyang. It's a terrifically costly battle. The Russians outnumber the Japanese by nearly 100,000 men, and both sides suffer casualties of about 75,000. So the Japanese have about 125,000 men engaged in the battle, and more than half of those men will be killed or wounded in the battle. This may be a case of a missed opportunity for the Russians, because certainly the Japanese could not have continued to fight another battle after this. Certainly not immediately. So it's possible that the Russians could have pressed their advantage and at least won the battle on land. However, they don't pursue this. I mean, the Russians have also lost 70,000 men. This is unprecedented in the scale of its destruction. So the Russian commanders replaced this battle, which is essentially a stalemate, although ultimately the Russians do more of the retreating, causes a lull in the hostilities long enough for Japan and the Japanese troops to catch their breath. So that battle goes on from the 23rd of February to the 10th of March. And immediately after that, on the 20th of March, Roosevelt is engaged, and Roosevelt offers to mediate a truce to the war. This truce, though, is delayed because we're sort of waiting for the main event, the arrival of the Second Pacific Squadron, or the Baltic Fleet. And it's in April when the ships sail by Singapore, and it's the end of May when they finally meet. And Togo, the Japanese admiral, has guessed that the Russians are simply going to take the most direct route to Vladivostok. And in fact, he's right, and this is going to take them through the Korean Strait, through the Straits of Tsushima. And so there's a great naval battle which takes place. The Russians have substantially more guns, but the Japanese have faster boats. And this speed advantage of the Japanese is heightened by the fact that the Russians have to carry all of their own coal in their ships, and so are actually weighed down by all the coal. Whereas Japan is in its home waters, it can easily go and get more coal should it have to retreat. And so actually Togo has some of the coal from his ships dumped overboard to make them even faster, to make them lighter. At the same time, because Japan is fighting in its own waters, it's been able to do a great deal of practice. And in fact, the Japanese Navy was much better prepared for war than the Russian Navy was at this point. Throughout, I mean, that was true in 1903 before the war began. But the Russian fleet has now been sailing for 7.5 months. And over the course of those 7.5 months, it hasn't had a chance to practice. It hasn't had a chance to do full-scale naval operations, which normally you would do because it's had to conserve all of its ammunition for what's going to prove at very least a critical battle for the Russian fleet. And so I think a combination of Japanese speed and tactics and some missed opportunities by the Russians leads to just the absolute annihilation of the Russian fleet at Tsushima. This war is completely decisive. The entire Russian fleet is essentially destroyed. All of the battleships are removed from battle, and it's basically impossible to overstate the importance of this battle and the importance of having a decisive battle. This is what the Japanese have wanted, and they get exactly what they want. And so it's within 2 weeks that the Tsar, on June 6th, has to ask for a peace treaty. The United States becomes the chief mediator here, and on August 9th, representatives from Japan and Russia will go to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and will begin peace talks. So the only other kind of key event that happens is that after the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese capture the Sakhalin Island, which you'll see just off the coast of Manchuria in Russia. And they're advised to do this by Roosevelt, who suggests to them that it will be a useful negotiating tactic for them to have this to negotiate off. And in fact, it does. Right now, I just want to focus on the practice of the war. But when we talk about the peace treaty and the effects, Sakhalin Island actually ends up being a really important thing for the Japanese to have had. So to go back and to look through our the 5 things we said we'd talk about at the beginning, when we think about how foreign intervention was important, Roosevelt intervening, yes, to mediate, but certainly having the advantage of the Japanese in mind is really important. And British and American money finances the Japanese war effort. Without that, it wouldn't have been possible. So the war couldn't have begun if it weren't for the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and it couldn't have continued if it weren't for Anglo-American funds. So I think the role of foreign governments is essential there. Add to that of course, there's a role that the Chinese people will play. The war is fought almost entirely, entirely really in China. And the Japanese have been cultivating some level of loyalty from the Chinese, especially in their intelligence services. Japanese spies are better paid than Russian spies, and so Japan gets the advantage there. When we think about the mobilization of human and economic resources, I think distance is the big thing I want to talk about here. No matter how mobilized Russia is, it simply has to travel so very, very far. And this distance that it has to travel ends up being essentially insurmountable, and it leads to these decisive battles, which favor the Japanese strategy. The land battles are absolutely devastating, unprecedented. And after the Yalu River battle, it's not, it's almost, even though these battles are supposed to be decisive, they end up being almost battles of attrition, which will become important later, when both sides are losing between 30 and 65% of their men to casualties. They simply didn't, I think, know how to press forward and press an advantage or press a counterattack at that point. In terms of the sea, we have the idea of the fleet at Port Arthur eventually being destroyed, and then there being the importance of speed playing a role at Tsushima. But really, the key idea to take away from this is that there is a decisive naval engagement which decides the war, and that's going to have major impacts on how people think about naval warfare for the next 40 years after the war. The importance of surprise is very important. That's what allows the Russian fleet to be trapped in the harbor in the first place. And that will be a lesson that's continued to be learned. In terms of technology, the war is intentionally pretty short, so there aren't a huge amount of technological innovations that come forward. We did talk about the portable rivers. But actually there's some older technology that ends up being pretty important and decisive. Naval mines, and then really the practice and education of the Japanese sailors ends up being of critical importance and gives them that huge advantage at Tsushima. At the Battle of Tsushima, the Russians have more guns and bigger guns, but the Japanese end up being more than twice as accurate with the shells that they fire. And that's an advantage that just can't really be overcome. So I hope that gives you some outline of the Russo-Japanese War, thinking about the importance of technology, the theaters of war, the mobilization of human and economic resources, and foreign intervention, and then just some small idea of the key battles. Thank you.